to clarify, a lot of West Bank is ruled by Palestinian Authority without Israeli military being there all the time.
Correct.
West Bank
Right.
is occupied is not really accurate as to how reality is. So.
Right. Sam's talking about area A's, B, and C, and sort of the distinction between area A, B, and C.
When the last session, the first session, that when you were trying to explain to us, this is not about Palestinians and Israelis, it's about the Israelis. Reading all of these things, I really understood what you were talking about, that we as Jewish people need to unite around our future, basically. And, I understand what you're trying to say from the first lesson.
Well, let me actually, let me start with that actually. So first off, actually, I'm going to start with an apology. I'm probably looking very dressed down today. I am in a sweatshirt because I'm doing physical therapy right after this. And I have found that physical therapy showing up in a suit is not conducive to the physical therapy that I need to do. So I'm going to, I ask for your forgiveness and how I might actually look. The classic Zoom things, I could have been in shorts and also a suit top. But I chose to actually be consistent today, and sort of a sweatsuit dynamic. The second thing is to sort of start.
You say it's not what you wear; it's what you say.
Yeah, thank you. Sarah, very much appreciate it. Thank you. All right. So the second thing is that one of the critiques that I received following the last session was that there was a feeling that I might have spent too much time talking about what we weren't going to discuss, right? And I want to, I totally value that, but it is something that I felt like I had to set up, partially because it was about framing sort of the ability to talk about what we are going to talk about, which is the diversity of opinion and how we can understand this from within the Jewish community. And so I felt like I needed to, at least at the outset, sort of set up what was sort of we were not going to be doing and what we were going to be trying to accomplish as well. So I hear that, I understand that there is a purpose behind it. The next thing is that someone just said was that effectively there was a conversation about like, wow, I really wish, given all the articles I sent out, if you even read a couple of them, you're going to see that there's just a huge range of perspective that's at play. And I remember actually, being with AIPAC in Israel on what I think was actually one of the most incredible trips that I've ever taken to Israel with AIPAC. And and having an opportunity to learn from Dr. Tal Becker, who we're going to hear from today. And really, after hearing from Dr. Becker, turning to a colleague and saying to the colleague, and this is a very specific thing that I said, was, boy, I really wish we could have a kind of conversation in the United States that held as much diversity and complexity and nuance and understanding of the differences of opinion, that we could have what the conversation we're having here in Israel, that we could have that in the United States. And I think that because I think very often, in the United States, it's, we get into sometimes, too easily polarities. The polarity of Israel, you're either, with her or against her, or the polarity of Israel can, Israel versus the sort of Israel can do no good, right? And can do no right. Mm-hmm. And those polarities are not only, I think, actually unhealthy for Israel sort of writ large, but they actually are unbelievably destructive within the Jewish community about how we in the Jewish community engage in this topic. So without sort of further ado, just a brief introduction to Dr. Tal Becker, and then we're going to continue to hear a lecture from him, and then we'll discuss that lecture afterwards. And if we have time, also connect with some Jewish texts that I think are important around this. So Dr. Tal Becker is a senior research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, and he is the principal deputy legal advisor at the Israel Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In his current position in the government, he is a senior member of the Israeli peace negotiation team and works on the front lines of many of Israel's most pressing diplomatic, legal, and policy challenges. And among his numerous positions, Dr. Tal Becker has been a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy, a senior policy advisor to Israel's Minister of Foreign Affairs. He is a lead negotiator. He was a lead negotiator in the Annapolis peace talks. He's the director of the International Law Department at the Israel Foreign Ministry. He's counsel to Israel's UN missions in New York, and an international law expert in the Israeli Defense Forces. He's also the author of a book called "Terrorism and the State: Rethinking the Rules of State Responsibility," which he won the Guggenheim Prize for Best International Law Book, and was the vice chairman of the United Nations General Assembly's Legal Committee. He was the first Israeli to hold a position of such stature in the 40 years at the time of the United Nations. Dr. Becker holds a doctorate from Columbia University and lectures widely throughout Israel and overseas, and is the recipient of numerous scholarly awards. So we're going to have an opportunity to listen from Dr. Tal Becker, and then we're also going to be able to have a conversation about it afterwards. As you listen to this, I want to encourage you to think about sort of the modalities, the range, the spectrum of ideas that he presents in this lecture.
Let's take a step back and try to look as objectively as we can at how the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, and especially the pursuit of what is called the two-state solution, is talked about today across the Jewish world. Now, we should acknowledge, of course, that peace, as an idea and as a Jewish value, is about much more than reaching some agreement on an Israeli-Palestinian two-state outcome. Peace is, at least in part, about a fundamental shift in consciousness and human action. And in Jewish sources, it is as much, if not more, connected to interpersonal relations than international relations. But our goal here is not to explore all the potential meanings of peace, but to understand how the Jewish discourse on peace plays itself out today. If we want to change and deepen this discourse, we need first to have a much better grasp of where it actually stands. And that means understanding with much more sensitivity the different attitudes that are expressed in relation to the idea that peace can be achieved through a two-state framework. For the sake of this exercise, we need to take politics out of the equation just for a moment and observe how peace is spoken about in practice, as if we were all psychologists listening to the Jewish people lying on the couch in front of us. If we do that, I want to suggest that we can see a spectrum of views that in the end can be encapsulated into 5 core positions on the two-state outcome. Most, if not all of us, fall somewhere along this spectrum. Some of us have moved from one point to another on the spectrum over time, or advance a combination of these points. But I think this spectrum of 5 positions helpfully defines the range of the Jewish conversation on this issue. And it is worth taking some time to map out these 5 positions, telegraphically, without claiming, of course, to present them in any exhaustive detail. As I do this, I want you to think about where you position yourself on the spectrum, but also to begin to appreciate the different values, assumptions, and ideas that animate each position on this spectrum, and may motivate people to take a position different from your own. I want you to try not to be angered by other positions, not to immediately think of the counter-argument, but to take the time to really listen to the position and think what sentiments may lay behind it when that position is genuinely and thoughtfully expressed. Let's begin with the first of those 5, which I would describe as people for whom the idea of 2 states, of achieving a 2-state outcome to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is a moral imperative for the Jewish people. The rhetoric, the language, the arguments that people in this camp use relate to the idea that the Jewish people should not be controlling another people. They speak in terms of Palestinian rights. They speak about the destructive role, in their view, of Israel's occupation. They make the claim that a people who have experienced the kind of persecution that the Jewish people have experienced throughout history should be champions of the rights to self-determination of others, not just their own. For advocates of this position, Palestinian statehood is not something we should avoid if we can and tolerate if we must. It is something for them that we as Jews are morally required to champion, even if we must at the same time seek to guarantee that that Palestinian state is a functioning and responsible neighbour to Israel. And so people who support this position couch an argument about peace in the language of what it is as Jews to be obligated to the rights of others. What is it that we need to do in order to ensure that we are acting morally in relation to the Palestinian people? They speak of a real urgency for big, immediate Israeli decisions to create a two-state outcome out of what they argue is our moral obligation. That's the first view, two states as a moral imperative. As we shift across the spectrum, there's a second view that you hear from some of the advocates of a two-state outcome, and that is the view of two states as a policy imperative, as something we need to do now to advance core Israeli policy objectives or national interests. People who speak in these terms tend less to use the language of moral obligation towards the Palestinians, but focus instead on how a two-state outcome is, in their view, necessary immediately in order to advance Israel's national interests. Advocates of this position tend to speak about the need to prevent Israel from being isolated in the world, of the need to deny oxygen to the forces of Israel's delegitimization. They speak about Israeli-Palestinian peace as critical to creating a cooperative environment with Sunni Arab states in the region, or enabling us to focus on greater challenges, whether internal to Israeli society or external, such as Iran. And they speak, perhaps most vocally, about a two-state outcome as necessary, as vital, in their view, to protecting Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. These kinds of policy arguments in favour of a two-state outcome are cast as being less about the Palestinians and their rights than they are about the welfare and security of Jews in a state of their own. But it is important to notice that this second position, even if couched more in policy terms, represents no less an adamant moral and values claim. The difference is that rather than focusing on the moral obligation to Palestinians, this position focuses on the moral imperative of self-preservation, the goal of advancing Israel's Jewish and democratic character, and of ensuring its enduring future as a place in which Jewish self-determination thrives and is engaged in the world. A third position on this spectrum is the idea of two states as an aspiration, as a worthy goal. Now, advocates of this position essentially say, yes, the goal of two states, of achieving self-determination for the Jewish and the Palestinian people, is the right moral objective. It's the right policy objective. But we just can't get there now. It's impossible, it's impractical, it's dangerous. And so for these people, while they don't abandon the idea, they say that for practical reasons, we don't have the option of making those big decisions now. And their focus becomes much more on what one might call managing the conflict, or keeping hope alive for a resolution sometime in the future. Advocates of this position focus on much more modest objectives: to protect Israel's shorter-term interests, to think of interim arrangements that protect the two-state aspiration, to cultivate coexistence as best we can, while at the same time explaining to the world and to ourselves that the option of actually achieving the two-state outcome is not currently available. This position too, which is quite widely held across the Jewish world, while it uses the language of what is practical, what is doable, has a clear potential moral underpinning. Doing only what is practical can be a moral conviction. True, it can sometimes be an excuse or reflect a kind of lack of higher aspiration. But it can also be driven by a strong belief that aspirations, as noble as they are, when implemented at the wrong time or pursued blindly without regard to what is realistically possible, can end up destroying many, many lives. And that being cautious and restrained is itself a moral requirement if what in the end matters is the welfare of the people you are trying to help. So these are three different ways in which advocates of a two-state outcome articulate their position, either as a moral imperative, or as a policy imperative, or as an aspiration, or perhaps sometimes as some combination of the three. If we continue along the spectrum, listening to the way the Jewish world talks today about peace, I think we hear two other positions that are in fact rejections of the two-state outcome. The first is the idea that a one-state outcome, not a two-state outcome, is a policy imperative. Now, the advocates of this position say essentially that it is impossible to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza without that state becoming a mortal threat to the future survival and legitimacy of the Jewish state. There is no version in their assessment of a Palestinian state that is not a failed state or a terror state that would endanger Israel. And so rather than maintain the current situation, the only real option under this view is to try to imagine a situation where Israel controls the entire territory indefinitely. And while Palestinians, according to this view, may be given certain rights of collective autonomy, rights as individuals or as citizens in an expanded state of Israel, or perhaps rights to territorial self-determination elsewhere, the capacity for Palestinians to establish a separate sovereign Palestinian state of their own in this geographical area is ruled out. And this position is expressed through a core policy argument, which is simply that Palestinian self-determination in the form of a sovereign Palestinian state would risk the future of the Jewish state, that there is no current version of sovereignty for such a state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River that would not involve a fundamental danger and denial of the Jewish right to self-determination eventually. Here again, the argument is presented in policy terms, but it seems motivated by a core moral, even if controversial, claim that the right and duty of Jewish self-determination and Jewish self-preservation in these circumstances trumps all other values and considerations. If we continue along this spectrum, there's one final voice that I want to describe, and that is the voice that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative. Not just that it's a policy requirement because of an assumption that a Palestinian nation state will never be able to live in true peace with a Jewish nation state, but that there is actually a moral reason why there should be a one-state outcome as a matter of fundamental principle. Now, it is very interesting to note that the view that a one-state outcome is a moral imperative is actually expressed both as a right-wing and a left-wing position. As a right-wing position, the argument is made that what is moral and right to do in this circumstance is to ensure that respect is given to whoever has a more valid claim to the land. For right-wing Jewish advocates of this position, that claim can be based on a divine promise of the land to the Jewish people, on the holiness of the land, or on a historical and legal claim which argues that the Jewish people are the rightful sovereign in this land, by strength, for example, of the League of Nations mandate, which designated this territory as a Jewish national home. What is important to appreciate about this position for the moment is that what animates it is a stated view that what is just and moral is to respect the stronger claim and connection to the land, which for advocates of this position is the Jewish claim. The left-wing version of one state as a moral imperative can come in the form of a counter-argument to the right-wing claim I just made, namely that it is the Palestinian claim to the land, not the Jewish claim, that is actually the stronger claim, and it is the one that needs to be validated. But this argument also comes in a different form, and that is to argue that a two-state outcome would essentially never be able to provide genuine equality both to Jews and Palestinians. The argument goes that it would necessarily undermine the rights of Palestinians, including refugees, to live throughout this land, and it would undermine the rights of Jews to live throughout this land. Advocates of this position often use the moral language of equality and argue in particular that the Palestinian state that would emerge as part of any two-state deal would necessarily be truncated. It would necessarily be less dignified and less equal than the Jewish state, in part because of the difference in power and security calculations between the two sides. And so for those who advance this view, the stated moral requirement here is less about guaranteeing collective self-determination in separate nation states than it is in the hope for a situation in which individual Jews and Palestinians can each live equally in this space, which requires, in their view, some kind of binational state or a neutral state. Now, all these 5 positions, 2 states as a moral imperative, 2 states as a policy imperative, 2 states as an aspiration, 1 state as a policy imperative, and 1 state as a moral imperative. All these positions exist within the Jewish world. And depending where you go, you hear different versions of them. And depending where you go, in most communities, some versions are considered absolutely unacceptable. And some versions are considered the mainstream or at least tolerable. And here it is important to be clear. I am not suggesting that every time these different positions are expressed, they reflect some deep and legitimate moral convictions by the people expressing them. Sometimes these positions are staked out thoughtlessly, in ways that are morally problematic or controversial, or even morally blind. Sometimes they are expressed in ways that show no real attempt to struggle with the reality on the ground, or for that matter, the reality of what may or may not be acceptable or even possible on the Palestinian side. And sometimes these positions are expressed without any regard for their broader moral implications and the potential injustices that could result if these positions were adopted wholesale. The goal here is not to legitimize each of these positions, however and by whomever expressed. It is to challenge ourselves to see, as observers and participants of the Jewish discourse on peace, what possible moral values could drive the different positions along this spectrum, and to ask ourselves seriously what possible place these values have in how we formulate our own positions and in the way we talk and listen to one another. To ask, for example, what weight and consideration should be given to values such as equality or the justness of a legal claim, even if our own position gives priority to some other value and leads us to some other conclusion. What claim should the values and moral convictions that could motivate other positions have upon us, even if we don't embrace them completely? And how do we take them seriously into account? As we go forward in this series, we're going to drill down and try to have a deeper understanding of the role of these values, the role that these values play in our tradition and our sources. We are going to see, hopefully, that even if we as Jews come out in different places along this spectrum, the values which, at their best, can drive other positions along this spectrum are values which we can connect with, which we can respect, and which we need to consider. So, for example, the idea that 2 states is a moral imperative because the Jewish people have, as a result of their tradition and experience, an obligation to the rights of others, is an idea, a value, that we can connect to as Jews even if we come out in a different place as to what weight to give this value in the circumstances. To take another example, 2 states as a policy imperative, 2 states as an aspiration, and 1 state as a policy imperative, all give significant weight to the value of self-preservation. They differ less about the significance of the value of self-preservation than about the application of that value to the facts. They may be influenced by different security experts, but at some level, they are not morally foreign from one another. Their practical conclusions are different, but their moral motivations are not. If that is true, if whether you support one outcome or another turns in practice on whether your factual assessment of the situation leads you to the conclusion that a Palestinian state is either a threat to peace or a critical ingredient for peace, then at least you need not see the person expressing a position different to yours as morally bankrupt, if that position is expressed by them seriously and thoughtfully. They may be analysing the facts differently, but they could be worthy of your moral respect, not your moral contempt. For too long now, the Jewish people seem to have been arguing about peace instead of actually talking about it. Too many of these conversations happen in echo chambers. We enter these conversations with our facts and our politics, and we leave them with our facts and our politics, without having really listened to one another. when there are these intense debates on Israeli-Palestinian peace on campus or in communities around the Jewish world, I have this feeling that people leave these sessions quietly saying to themselves, you know, I was really impressed with the point of view of that person that I already agreed with. And then saying, you know, I really didn't like the point of view of that person that I already didn't agree with. We listen only for what we want to hear, for that which reaffirms what we already think. In some ways, the intensity and passion with which these debates happen is puzzling. We engage in argument with each other as if that very conversation were going to decide how to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we know, of course, that a talk at your local synagogue or JCC or Shabbat table may not be the place where the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be decided. The truth is that the way we have these arguments about peace across Jewish communities may not determine the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they may well determine the future of our communities. For too many communities, really talking about peace, as opposed to just arguing about it, is almost impossible. Paradoxically, it is the issue of peace itself and the argument around it, perhaps more than any other, that can be the most polarizing and acrimonious. For some rabbis and communal leaders, the issue has become so toxic, so volatile, that they decide it's better not to touch it. If we want to claim peace as a core Jewish value, if we want to stop it from being something that ruptures communities and alienates many Jews both from Israel and from one another, if we want to be a people that champions deep, respectful, meaningful dialogue, then we need to figure out how we engage this issue of peace, not just as a shallow political conversation, but as a deeper values conversation. A kind of conversation that is not just about exchanging facts and arguments on a policy level, but also excavating the moral principles behind those positions and thinking how we should calibrate them. We need to take seriously the values that shape our position. We need thoughtful answers as to why we prioritize some values over others. And we need to insist that others cast their position in ways that take values seriously as well. We need a conversation that is neither blind to the complexities and excruciating dilemmas associated with the pursuit of peace in the real world, but not blind either to the importance our tradition and ideas place on the goal of coexistence and peace as quintessential Jewish values and as an animating principle for the Jewish people. It is important to understand that we do not need to do all this in order to reach some grand agreement on how to achieve peace. I'm not even sure consensus is a goal we should aspire to as a people, even if it were possible. Our tradition and value perspectives are too diverse and rich to be exhausted by one opinion, and the reality is just too complex for there to be one answer. We need to reimagine the conversation about peace, first because our health and unity as a people depends in large part on our ability to really talk to each other, to see the merit and the humanity and the values in one another. And second, because if our positions on the challenges facing peace for Israel are not grounded in a serious values conversation, they cease to be compelling, and they risk becoming disconnected from who we want to be as a people of moral excellence. And they risk disconnecting us from Israel in the process. Some may think that the way we argue about peace is basically inevitable, that we don't have an option but to shout at each other, to delegitimize each other. The stakes are too high, the emotions are too raw. But this series, and the I Engage project as a whole, is committed to the idea that we are better than that. That an ancient people with the experience, responsibility, and traditions that we have are capable of imagining a different kind of conversation with one another, even on the most difficult issues. You know, we often think that change is impossible before it happens, and then think it's inevitable after it happens. It's going to be in our hands to make that change. And maybe the first step is to begin to connect to and take seriously not just the facts and positions that suit us, but the values that we hold dear and that others hold dear. If we can do that, we can begin to learn how to talk about peace and not just argue about it. We can help reclaim peace as a real and relevant Jewish value. And no less importantly, we can advance the solidarity of the Jewish people and the health and vibrancy of Jewish life. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Okay, I'm going to actually find my Zoom boxes again, because my Zoom boxes are somehow not there. So hold on for 1 second. I need to find you on my screen. You've somehow minimized. So let me bring everyone back up. Hi, everyone. All right. So let me also share another piece. So effectively, just sort of as a reminder, is everyone seeing my screen share?
Yes.
Great. Okay. What Dr. Becker is saying, right? Is that, and can you still see it? Okay. Okay. So for decades, literally for decades now, we have had an issue within the Jewish community where we've been arguing about peace, right? And that we're all about sort of very often, particularly within communities, but very often we're in our own echo chambers. And there's sort of inside of their own echo chambers, each camp sort of marshaling its own facts to the defense of that particular echo chamber. And we find it often very difficult to listen to facts that go against the grain of our own narrative and the grain and go against sort of the ideas that we're presenting within the conversation. And very often at the same time, what ends up happening is that talking about peace as opposed to sort of arguing about the specific arguing about the specific politics behind it make it really, really difficult to actually have any sort of serious conversation. This is what we're talking about, and what I talked about at the last session is that this is about developing tools to have meaningful, respectful, and serious conversations about peace with people with whom we do not necessarily agree, about ideas that are different than our very own. And as I said in the email that I sent out yesterday, or that we sent out yesterday, or Monday, is that we need to be able to. We don't necessarily need to reach agreement. I share opinions that are not necessarily mine, precisely because it's about reimagining the conversation and really about the health and well-being of ourselves as a community, and frankly, the larger Jewish community. The goal here is not to have a political conversation or advance or endorse any particular political viewpoint. That's not my goal. I'm happy to share sort of where I personally stand and can talk about that. But I think it's really important that I don't have a goal of in this session about sharing a particular political viewpoint with you or advance any particular political perspective with you, because that's not the goal of the series. That's not my particular goal in this conversation. What I do think is important is that we are talking about sort of the spectrum of views. We're going to talk more about this in future sessions as well. But the spectrum of views as something that's important about how we are talking about the two-state solution, or excuse me, about peace. And as Dr. Becker really talks about, there are these sort of 5 core positions. And in these 5 core positions, right, there is this position 1, which is that the two states as this moral imperative, right? The idea that the Jewish people should not be controlling another people, right? Palestinian rights are to focus on this position, and Israel's occupation is seen as really destructive. Like, Jews of all people should be champions of the rights of self-determination for others, and for advocates of this position, there is an urgency for Palestinian statehood precisely because of a sense of Jewish moral obligation to Palestinians. In position 2, right, which is 2 states as a policy imperative, in this position, right, we're recognizing that we need 2 states in order to advance Israel's national interests. It's different than a moral argument. There's a moral argument there, but it's really about how we are advancing Israel's national interests. Advocating for this position tends to sort of talk about the need to prevent Israel from being isolated in the world, or the need to deny oxygen to the forces of Israel's delegitimization. And advocates often speak about Israel-Palestinian peace as critical to creating a cooperative environment with Arab states in the region, or to enabling us to focus on greater challenges, whether internal to Israeli society or external, such as Iran, or even to speak about peace as necessary to protect Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, right? That's the policy imperative, Jewish and democratic, or Jews vis-a-vis Iran, or Jews vis-a-vis with other Arab states. In order to counter Iran, there needs to be a 2-state solution, right? And the difference between these 2 perspectives is that the 2-state solution lies on this sense of moral claim, is that in the first, the focus is on what is owed morally to the Palestinians and the kind of ethical Israeli society that we wish to create, or we want to be created. The second focuses on the moral imperative of self-preservation, right? The goal of advocating Israel's Jewish democratic character and ensuring that its future as a place of which there is Jewish self-determination, and that Jewish self-determination is thriving. All right. Third position, the middle position, right, is 2 states as, and by the way, I also want to make an add that Dr. Becker said this in his lecture, but I think it's important. Very often you might find yourself in one of these positions, and over time, as Milt said at the very beginning of the session, right, over time, because of how things have changed and transformed, you might find yourself in a different place based on the experience of the first intifada or the second intifada, or whatever the case may be. You might find yourself actually in a really different place than where you are now, right? So the third position is this position of Israel. In the political, as a 2-state solution, as aspiration, right? And the focus of this, of the people who hold this position, is that it becomes about managing the conflict or keeping hope alive for the resolution in the future, right? In other words, there's a desire to have a 2-state solution, but in the reality of right now, it's just not possible. In the meantime, right, we're going to focus on really modest objectives. We want to protect Israel's short-term interests, protect a 2-state, aspiration, cultivate coexistence as best as we possibly can. We want to, we sort of explaining to the world and to ourselves that the option of actually achieving a 2-state outcome is just not currently available to us, right? And I think that what he's saying is that there is a connection between the policy imperative of 2-state solution of the, in the spectrum just to the left, and also the policy of a 1-state perspective and to the right. This in this sense, the position is really couched in the language of what is practical and what is doable, and has a clear potential of and a clear moral underpinning. So doing what is practical can be a moral conviction driven by a belief that aspirations, as noble as they are, when implemented at the wrong time, can end up destroying many people's lives. And that being cautious and restrained is itself a moral requirement if what in the end matters is the welfare of not only the Israeli people, but also the Palestinian people. Option 4 is this one state policy imperative. And this is the advocates that say that it is impossible, it is going to be absolutely impossible to establish a Palestinian state in the West Bank and in Gaza without posing a moral threat to the future survival and legitimacy of the Jewish state. and that there is no version in their assessment of a Palestinian state that is not a failed state or becomes a terrorist state that would effectively endanger Israel. And rather, they maintain that the current, they would rather sort of maintain the current situation. So rather than maintaining the current situation, right, they see that the only real option is to try to imagine a situation where Israel controls the entirety of the territory indefinitely. And while Palestinians, according to this view, may be given certain rights, the capacity for the Palestinians to establish a separate government in their own geographical area, that's ruled out. Here again, the argument is presented in policy terms, but is also motivated by this moral position that the right and duty of the Jewish state is focused on Jewish self-preservation. I'm noticing some things that are in the chat box. I can't totally get to this. Hold on for one second. Option number 5 is sort of the policy, sort of one state solution as a moral imperative. And this position of one state as a moral imperative is expressed both as a right-wing position and a left-wing position. Okay, and that's I think important. He mentions this, but I think it's really important to sort of state this out and get this. The right-wing position is the argument is made that what is moral and right to do in this circumstances is to ensure that the respect is given to whoever has a more valid claim to the land. And for right-wingers, right, they're advocates of this position that they claim that because of a divine promise of the land to the Jewish people, or a historical and legal claim according to this, that the Jewish people have on the land, that the Jewish people are the rightful sovereign owners of the land. And what animates this position is a stated view of what is just and moral and respectable about a stronger sort of Jewish claim and connection, historical connection to the land. The left-wing version of this makes the entirely opposite version. There's always that sort of thing. It's like sometimes you go so far to the right, you sort of whip around to the left, or you go so far to the left, you sort of whip around to the right. That is also the case here, because there is a left-wing version of this that makes the entirely opposite argument, but still for a moral imperative for one state. And that is that the Palestinian claim is actually the stronger claim than the Jewish claim. It argues that a two-state outcome would never be able to provide genuine equality to both Jews and to Palestinians, and it would necessarily undermine the rights of Palestinians. And so in that sense, the stated moral requirement is to enable a situation where Jews and Palestinians can live equally in peace and with each other. And so these are the sort of the spectrum that at least Tal Becker is really setting up. And I want to take a moment and sort of inquire, with you about sort of where you are, right? How is the two-state solution discussed in our community? What are the core differences that you think separate us? But also, where would you place yourself in Dr. Becker's 5-part spectrum of views, and which values guide your position on the spectrum? So let's ask that. Let's sort of ask that question. And as we're doing that, I'm going to invite you to go ahead and unmute yourself. Right. So, how have you heard the two-state solution discussed in our community? And, what do you think are the core differences that separate us? But also specifically, if you could start off, share how you would place yourself on the spec in the 5-part spectrum, if you will. Would anyone want to go first on that one?
Sure.
All right, Bob, go for it. I think I heard your voice.
Yeah, I would say that we see a lot of the spectrum across all 5 views in this community. I've heard all 5 expressed, although I think the ones most commonly expressed are the moral imperative for a two-state solution. I think probably is the majority. For me personally, I think I probably am in the middle. I think it's the idea of a two-state solution is wonderful, but I don't think we can get there at this point. I think if you look at the history of it, every time Israel has tried to come to peace, starting at the very beginning of the original creation of the state and partition, the other side has not come to the table. And Gaza is a perfect example of what happens when you create a Palestinian state, although there are exigencies about having to blockade and so forth that taint that. But instead of pulling out and then creating a state that lives next to you, it becomes the basis for rocket attacks and tunnels and all these other things. So I think for the time being, it's very difficult to see how we could arrive at a two-state solution. And the other problem is the one-state solution. Is it a one-state solution where Palestinians have secondary rights, which is the apartheid argument, or do they get full citizenship in the single state and outpopulate the Jews, and the idea of a Jewish state goes away? So I just think right now that as unfortunate as the status quo makes some sense, and at least for the time being, the idea of the practical sense of a two-state solution in appealing to other Arab states doesn't seem to be required, because the Sunni states are so opposed to and afraid of Iran that I think that they've come to and will continue to come to terms with Israel unless there's some real blow up between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Great. Thank you. Yeah.
Michael Norman here. I have a question, and I'll answer the question that you asked. One of the things that has not been discussed, and I'm not a historian, so of this particular issue, came up in the seventh reading by Yehoshua, where he talks of the seventh thing that you recommended that we read from 2011, where he talks about no more problematic concept in regard to Jewish identity than of homeland. In other words, the concept that recognizing a homeland is the cornerstone under which every national identity is constructed. And it overrides language, it overrides religion, it overrides other issues. My question then is, does the Palestinian state, the Palestinians hold the same conviction to a location, a homeland, that the Jews do? And if they do, tell me about it, or tell us about it. And the corollary is the argument that the Jews have no greater homeland affiliation. For God's sakes, we started out in Israel and Egypt, and then we went back to Egypt. When Moses went forth, he didn't go to a particular location. So that my question is, what's the answer to that? Because it would help Judy and me sort of sort out where we stand.
I want to make sure I understand the question right. So can you say the first question again? I want to make sure I heard it correctly.
If you believe that a people's connection to its homeland is paramount argument, do the Palestinians have a similarly strong argument that the Jews purportedly have?
Yeah. So I think that the Palestinians have a pretty strong argument for having a homeland, and the question, just as you know, and I think that the challenge is that we start to get into moral relativism about whose claim is first and whose claim, and I just, it's hard to get into that argument without where does that argument lead us, except for that we have a group of individuals, a group of people who have who've been on the land for pretty significantly long period of time, and whose family, in generations of family who are there. And that is a real challenge. And the challenge, I think, partially is that I think Dr. Becker and I have had in other conversations, is that, one does not, to be pro-Palestinian does not necessarily make you anti-Israeli, right? And to be pro-Israel doesn't automatically make you anti-Palestinian, right? And I think that we've got to get real careful about that distinction. I personally, right, sort of where Bob is in terms of being in the middle of the spectrum, aspirational but very concerned about what the reality is of what could happen, given the lack of leadership in the with the Palestinian government. I am concerned about all of the moral questions, and also recognize, so I'm concerned from a policy perspective and some of the moral questions, and at the same time also recognize that, like, I very deeply want what's good for the Palestinians, and that does not make me anti-Israel. And similarly, when I am like as pro-Israel as I could possibly be, that just does not make me anti-Palestinian, right? It just doesn't. And that, I think that is part of the conundrum of the conversation sometimes around this. And we have a lot of hands up. David, Yvette, and then Janice.
Okay. I think we should all be grateful that Dr. Becker has given us that linear spectrum of 5 positions, but I may not be unique in feeling that I'm in more than 2 of the positions at once. I found, frankly, his diagram somewhat simple-minded in that the Venn diagrams had only 2 positions overlapping each time. I'm in many of the positions for many of the reasons. I believe there is a moral imperative for several reasons for a 2-state solution. I also share the what some now call the right-wing point of view. There's a religious imperative, but perhaps more than anyone else at this moment, I see the practical consequences. I was the first American Jewish scientist invited for a scientific exchange to Palestinian land in the year 2000. And I accepted that invitation only to have the second Intifada erupt while I was on the American portion of my sabbatical. And I was urged by the scientific leaders in Ramallah not to keep the appointment and to try to come later. A policeman showed up at the building where I was to meet with people in Ramallah, and he was killed and thrown out of a 2nd-story window. So the situation there is very dire. We know about extremists on the religious side, but do you all know that there are extremists on the Muslim side who see the world, not just that land, as only coming in 2 parts, the part that is already Muslim and the part that is yet to become Muslim. So what I'm saying is that there's a practical need to be aware of what security advisors are telling us at any time, and to keep a hope alive for a 2-state solution, but not to do anything so rash and foolish as to wear a kick-me sign that endangers the continued viability of the Jewish community. And by that, I don't just mean our community here or the community in Israel. I mean all of the Jewish community. Not an easy problem, multidimensional, not a simple linear Olympic-style 5 rings. It's more complicated than that.
I value that, and I think that it's important. I said earlier, and there is a spectrum. I think part of it was trying to show what a spectrum, right, of opinion, and to sort of at least put it into that. But I think that Tal will be the first person to say that that you might find yourself holding multiple positions at one time and going in between those positions, given also dynamics that are on the ground, and how that shifts. Yvette, and then Janice.
Thanks, Rabbi. So I guess I came into this with this feeling that, the Israelis fought so hard when they became a state, and all the leaders back then, and all the effort that they put into creating an Israeli state. And the land itself, that they have water, they have buildings, they have everything, and they did it by, sheer grit. And so my feeling was always, it's Israel, and the Palestinians are welcome to live there, but it's a one state. But listening to this today, I do understand the other side. And I have to say that I am glad that I did hear it, because yes, I can see there are other points of view and there are other ways of looking at it. But it's hard to say that, Golda Meir and
That's right.
Ben Gurion and those people did all of this and we're going to give it away. But then again, that was 60 years ago, 70 years ago. It's not now. And we all have to recognize the state of the world is different too, right?
Yeah. Janice, thank you.
Okay, I am falling between position 3 and 4. It's an aspiration, but not very practical. And I had a question as to where the people in Israel fall on the spectrum, if there's a consensus, if they lie, because they're the ones that live with it.
So do you know how there are multiple elections and there is election after election after election after election?
Yes.
That's exactly what the problem here.
Is that the position strictly on the two-state, or
no? Yeah, I mean,
no,
it's really complicated. So depending on not just the political party, but like if you're Meretz, you're on the left-hand side. If you are Likud or Israel, Beitenu, you might be on the actually sort of center right, and there are certain religious groups that are on the far right, right? So it is really complicated, and I would say that, and to David's point, very often you will see political groups actually be right wing in some areas and very left on the others. But like the part of the challenge is that actually in Israel you're seeing all of these, and probably more, right? Because we're Jewish. But you're seeing all of these perspectives in play, and they're absolutely in play in the politics. And the very reason why you had such difficulty getting a government to form is because Israelis actually hold all of these positions in a much more nuanced way than Americans do.
Okay.
Like, and there's and I just want to add something. There is a respect in Israel that people who, within your own family, there's actually respect that all of these positions are held this way, much more so than in the United States. And that, I think, is actually a fascinating thing. In the United States, there's been a huge push to push it into some polarities. That is not the case. That is not what's happening in Israel in terms of the dialogue. Okay. Right. And I think it might be because there's a respect of a multi-party system in Israel that actually doesn't really exist here. And everyone's in experience with it. All right, Amy, and then Milt.
Okay, so I had an opportunity over a several year period to study the Islamic tradition and attend mosque as a guest in several places in California, and they do hold as a part of their basic belief that everyone, just something like the Christians, that everyone's going to become Muslim at some point. And that would be seen as okay, people have that belief and everybody can live together. But they also call people that are not Muslim derogatory terms. One of them is ghosts, and that they don't really have souls. And for this reason, that they can, go out and harm them and everything like that. I know that the people in Israel know this. I don't know what the answer is. I hate to see the Palestinian people brought to their knees without food, without jobs, living in poverty. I understand then the side of the people in Israel. Gee, if we give them an inch, they're going to come and kill us. What's the answer? Who has that answer? That's what I want to ask you.
I'm going to ask you to hold on to that because I'm not sure that I'm going to give you an answer that's going to be that you're going to necessarily like. And I think it's really complicated because I'm not sure not sure that I actually have the answer. I will tell you that, like, you know, applying to HUC, when I applied to HUC, one of the people who was on my committee asked me why, after one of my responses, because of experience that I had studying in Israel and Jordan and writing about the peace process. I don't know if people know that my part of my master's work was on the evaluation in undergrad. I went to undergraduate and then undergraduate school for international relations, and part of my master's work was on evaluating the peace process between Jordan and Israel. And so I went to HUC and I decided to leave the master's program and become a rabbi. And so part of my master's work was on sort of looking at the peace process between Jordan and Israel. And I was sort of asked in one of my interviews about whether or not why I was like such a Palestinian lover, right? It was a fascinating art question. I felt like I think they were trying to needle me. I got through the question A-okay and am a rabbi now through it all. That said, I will also say that when I was living in Israel, I lived through the second Intifada and lived through 20 suicide bombings that year in 2001, 2002. The closest of which was quite literally across the street from my apartment, right? In which we had to have people clear out physical remains from our balcony. Okay. And then I've seen in my own personal experience that even I, as a peacenik, right, who wrote about peace in his master's thesis, also saw what happens when you put up a wall and you end up not having suicide bombers anymore, right? And I have been to the West Bank on multiple occasions and seen the poverty and the challenges that are there in areas A, B, and C, and differently in areas A, B, and C. And I'm not sure it's a sustainable solution. And most recent time I was in Israel, felt more assured than ever that even though I see Israel as aspirationally, hopefully have a two-state solution, I felt like we were further away from that aspiration than I've ever experienced a couple of years ago. So even in myself, right, I don't have an answer for you, but even in myself, I want to be really clear that I have gone the gambit, and there's a part of me that actually is much more hawkish actually than I probably would ever sort of say, in saying that I actually do wonder what would happen if you had an actual state and then held that state responsible for what that state does, right? So I actually take a sort of potentially a left-wing perspective that also includes a hard reaction to what would happen if there was a terrorism from that state. And that's a very, like, give legitimacy to the state, but then hold that state responsible. And that could be a very hawkish position too, which is even different than one of these perspectives. So all that is to say, I'm not sure I have an answer for you. It is really complicated. And I think that we have to live in that complication and understand and respect the varying views, precisely because if we don't, we have a way of creating division within the Jewish community in ways that are actually not beneficial for us. Sam, do you want to, Milt, you were going to say something and then Sam.
Yeah, I don't even know where I am on this type of thing, but I became very, not enlightened. I became listening to the one-state solution, which I hadn't been listening to in prior years, that anytime you create a two-state solution, you're already setting up some major conflicts of self-control and things like that. One of the things I noticed that there wasn't a sixth thing. You had an aspirational two-state solution. There wasn't an aspirational one-state solution. And I'm wondering if the aspirational thing, the middle one, could be both ways, aspirational two-state, aspirational one-state. So that if you had a one state, everybody is starting from the thing, everybody has rights going in there. And the idea is to control the terrorism that would be involved with that thing. But until you can have Palestinians feel that they have a right, not just to a small piece, but a right within the state, and that Israel has a right to the entire state, and that deal with what you need to deal with to have that one state. The biggest thing for me was the question of the right of the return. When you deal with the right of return, then you're dealing with a tremendous population of Palestinians coming back into the state, and what the conflicts politically are there. But aspirationally for me would be like, get them all together, one state, stop infringing on each other's borders.
Okay. Sam, do you want to, please?
Yeah, I don't mean to be like the fact checker, but I do think it's important that people know that in the West Bank, it's not like a slum in India where there's gross poverty all over the place. I mean, I've been there. I've been to colleges where there are well-dressed students walking around acting like typical college students, a lot of cars, restaurants open, big buildings. Not to say things are rosy there, but people should not say it's like a totally impoverished place for thousands and thousands or millions of people. It's just an observation, but
no, I value that. I think a couple things. I don't know if you've been to Gaza, but I have, and Gaza is really not good. I mean, I haven't been to Gaza since they closed off Gaza, but even before closing off Gaza, it was really not good. And the second thing is that I would say is that I think it really depends. While I agree with you in terms of area, definitely in terms of different areas A, B, and C, there are certain areas in areas A that have very high impoverished rates that and the restriction of movement to be able to work in Israel, depending on on what's actually happening with that, does absolutely impact the ability of Palestinians to make a living. And so it is a very, it is not the delta between where the kinds of financial capacity that Israelis have and the kind of financial capacity that majority of Palestinians have is big, and I'm not sure how sustainable that is in the long run. But I do agree, it's not as the West Bank is not as bad. First off, the West Bank is not nearly like Gaza, but I also think Gaza is a concern about what would happen potentially in the West Bank, and that would be, to Tal Becker's point, a very unsustainable. Like if there was a Gaza East and a Gaza West, if you will, that would be a very bad situation for Israel.
Yeah, and again, this is maybe too much in the weeds, but some of the poverty, for instance, in the West Bank, is in camps, which are not enforced by Israelis. They're enforced
Correct.
by one group of Arabs against another to keep people in these camps. And in Gaza, there's lots of money that has gone in from Qatar and around the world that has been diverted from human
for terrorist purposes.
Yeah, so it's not, I'm not disputing some of the facts, but why those areas are like that really
100%.
not blamed on Israeli impoverishing its the Arabs. So.
No, 100%. I mean, Gaza, Hamas has no one to blame but themselves. In all reality, about how they have used money and diverted money for terrorist purposes rather than for the building of their own country. And I think which goes back to Yvette's point, right? I think is exactly right. Like, take a look at what the mindset is about how Israel has used its resources to build up the ability of Israel to be a world player. And to have the kind of financial capacity it has, and and we're just going to give that up. Like, what are we really like? I think it goes to that point 100%. Again, I want to be clear. In an hour, we're not going to get through all of it. But Sam, I really appreciate the corrective, and I understand what you're saying. I absolutely do. And hopefully other people heard that too. All right. So with that, we're gonna continue to discuss this. And the conversation next time is going to actually be about sort of how we live with the differences. and how we, and particularly given sort of, different ideas, we're going to be talking about how we actually live with these differences of opinions, even through sometimes really difficult experiences like what happened just recently in Gaza, right? And how our community and how is torn by it, but also sometimes how it's torn at us, with other communities. Now, at the end of this, we were supposed to have an opportunity to break down into various different groups, and we have the breakout groups really set up. Tracy has the breakout group set up. There are two groups who are going to be talking about what we talked about today. And this is based on what you previously signed up for when you signed up, and one group just for having some social interaction. And then you have also a group of people who did not want to go into breakout groups, and that's a-okay. We are not forcing you into breakout groups. I promise. So it's all by your choice. But next time we will have a good conversation about sort of the current how we live with these differences and perspectives as well. So thanks for participating today. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email me. I can answer them the best I possibly can. But really appreciate the opportunity to learn together today.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. It was
Thank you.
really good discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.